Hi, welcome to my latest online video. This one is 3 ways to mix watercolor on paper. Now I know many of you work in the studio and it's probably not something that you think about that much, and certainly working wet into wet is a very common thing to do in the studio. But when you're out in the field and you've got a little tiny paint kit like this one here, there's not a lot of places to mix. As well, you need to work quickly because the wind's blowing, the sun's shining, your paint is drying quickly, and so quick mixing is important. So today I want to talk about mixing your colors, your watercolors on your paper as you're working on a picture. So what I have here is actually a picture that I started last weekend when I was outdoor sketching, and I didn't quite get it finished, and so I have some things that I'm going to finish on it today and just give you an idea of how to do it, the different kinds of ways that you can do it, and also let you see what it looks like, because these are finished areas and I'll explain towards the end what technique was used in each one. Okay, so let's get started. So the first way I want to talk about is mixing wet and placing them side by side. So here I have a kind of a dark area of moss that's quite dark, and I've mixed my green with a bit of permanent rose to give it this really dark kind of edge to it. So first of all, I'm going to put this. Now as you notice, you can even see that there are blobs of water there, that this is actually quite a wet mix. And there, I'll just put some water drops there so you can actually see the water drops. Now as it goes up, I want my my moss to have a lighter, more golden color to it. So now I'm taking that same green, and I'm using hooker green, by the way. I like a pre-mixed green, and then I like to add stuff to it, and I like what happens with it. So while this is still quite wet, I'm now going to paint my lighter color next to it. And as you can see, the colors are still distinct, but there is a blending. I'm going over top of both of them, and that line got a little bit dry while I was doing this. There, that's better. And so you can see that there is, they're beside each other, that we still have the distinct colors, but there is a blended area, and that's what I'm looking for. So that's what happens when you put your wet into wet beside each other. Of course, you can do the most common thing and drop a bit of color right into it while it's really wet, and that's always a good thing to do too. So example, if I just drop in some of this red permanent rose, it'll just let it do its thing. So that's really wet into wet, but this wet beside each other is another very useful thing. So we'll just let that go, and maybe I'll just put another little spot of that over here and just drop that in. It'll give it a kind of a rusty flavor there. So now the next way is, as you notice, this is starting to dry here. So I'm having a little bit more, now this is not totally dry, but it is drier. And to really push the yellow in my moss, now if I take just the straight yellow and just butt it up to it, again I get a nice blend of the two colors, but now I'm starting to see a border, which is kind of good. If you want, especially like here where you want that puffiness, you need to have these soft and hard edges in order to get the colors to mix together. So here, just putting in the yellow beside it, while the other green is quite dry, and I like to overlap it a little bit too, because that gives me a nice color combination there. And then this is getting darker again, so I'm going to just put some of the darker up here at the top, and again this is more wet into wet, and get a little more green into that. So this is more wet into wet, and so now it's kind of drifting together a little bit again. I'm getting that up in here and just touching that there again. There's still a need to do some mixing on your little tray. If you notice, I pop over there because you want to make sure that what the water level is like, and you want to also make sure that the paint is even distributed on your brush so that you have control over what you're doing. So here, now I can, there's a little bit of sunlight here, so now I'm going to go into a different yellow and just get it even brighter. So I'll get this yellow little, so again, I have the wet here. And while it's still wet, I'm going to put in some of my green around the edges here and just let those mix together. Okay. And just get some of that yellow in there now, and so that I have my different greens happening. Okay, so just as a quick review while this is drying, I have two very wet colors, one wet on the paper, one wet on the brush, and I run them along the edge, or I drop them in, the one color into the other. That's the really wet combination. The next step that I showed you was here, where I had sort of dry, wasn't totally dry, and then I painted along the edge and let them butt up and overlap them a little bit, just to give that blend of color. And you see there's a gradation of color here. Now the third way, which is nice to do and I have to wait till this dries, is now mixing with a dry color on your paper and a wet brush. And in this case you don't want it too wet, just have it enough. And so I'll take it and just kind of dry it here on my paper towel to get the water out of it, and I'll just check, oh, that's still quite wet here. This is kind of drier around here, so just kind of put, now this is a bit of cobalt teal blue, and I like to add this. It just kind of poofs up my greens a little bit, changes them a little bit, so I'm just going to do that. And here I've got wet into wet. And notice the difference between the two. When it's wet into wet, we get another green again, which is kind of a neat green. And over here we get something else totally happening. So I'm kind of looking at both of those and thinking, well, I kind of like the kind of things that are happening. While those are drying, I can be working on other parts of my picture, and that seems to be what needs to happen right here. So I need another coat of. Here again, now I'm intensifying a color by putting another layer on top of what's here. So now this is glazing, but again, it's mixing color on the paper. So you can do it with the same color to intensify, or you can do it with a new color to add a different flavor to what you have there. So this is a great tool to use when you're especially outdoor sketching. You just don't have time to fiddle around mixing, and you only have little trays to work with anyway. So having to mix it quickly on your paper is really a wonderful thing. Wendy teaches outdoor sketching classes in the summer, and she teaches in her studio and online throughout the year. Wendy produces original work in pencil and in watercolor. She completes commission work, particularly pet portraits, and produces cards and prints from some of her work.